Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 6 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New York Rangers, in which the Sharks have won 3-2 in overtime. It finally happened. The Sharks may have set a new franchise record with 5 straight losses to start a season, but they do not end up setting a new franchise record just a couple of days later by losing 6, as they get the victory here tonight. They had already secured their first point of the entire season just by going to overtime, but they also get the game winner there, and it's kind of surprising as the Rangers are, besides the Hurricanes, I guess, the best team that the Sharks have played thus far this season, and yet you might not know it from watching this game. What was also quite interesting is that this was actually David Quinn's former team. The first team he ever coached as a head coach in the NHL was the New York Rangers, and interestingly enough, his first head coaching victory with that Rangers team was against the San Jose Sharks. So the fact that he gets his first Sharks head coaching victory against the New York Rangers is, things can end up being kind of funny sometimes. Now, in the first period, this one started off as most of the Sharks games have started off thus far this season. The Sharks played a first period in which they were okay. I wouldn't say they were amazing. They were mostly just plagued by taking a ton of penalties in this one, but they were doing solidly on the penalty kill. They didn't allow the Rangers to score and would get a goal of their own on a power play with Logan Couture to make it 1-0. But as we have seen already in the first 5 games of this season, after the first period that usually goes pretty well for the Sharks, everything falls apart in the second, and it really looked to be going that way once again. The Rangers tied it up pretty early on with a goal from Hedl. Then it was taken the lead by Panarin to make it 2-1, and honestly, I had kind of packed this game away once again, but the Sharks got a goal from an unlikely suspect, Radim Shemek, to make it 2-2, and that would be the score heading into the third period. Now, I still didn't have too much faith, and you can't really blame me for that because of how the Sharks have looked through the first 5 periods, but they came out in this third and potentially played their best period of the season thus far. They limited the New York Rangers to a grand total of a single shot on goal, and then they themselves had about, 15 shots, I believe, in that third period. Now, of course, they didn't manage to get another one past Igor Shesterkin, and so we would go to the overtime, but it was still a very remarkable effort from the San Jose Sharks in a tie game going into the third period. In the overtime, David Quinn thankfully actually puts out 3 good players. Meier, Hertl, and Carlson are the 3 players to start the overtime. Maybe if this was Bob Booner, we would have seen some sort of weird combination of Steven Lorentz with Nick Bonino, and then with the back end of Matt Benning for some reason. But we get the 3 best players here on the San Jose Sharks, and they make the play happen. Erik Karlsson, a fantastic effort. He spins off Artemi Panarin, and even though he ends up falling over, he feeds the puck over to Timo Meier, gets back up, eludes coverage, and then picks up the pass from Meier, puts it into the pretty much wide open net, and wins the game for the San Jose Sharks. So finally, they are on the board. The 5-game losing streak comes to an end, and they are not the last team with 0 points in the league. I believe that title now goes to the Minnesota Wild. Moving on to the lineup here tonight, we did actually see some pretty big changes, besides the usual that we have seen in the past few games of just swapping out one 4th line player. The Sharks actually moved a couple of names around here. So the first line was returned to be Barabanov, Hertl, and Meier. Obviously, Hertl and Meier were separated for the game against the New York Islanders. They are put back together, and they had a couple of decent chances early on in this game, but they certainly ended up picking up a lot more steam there in the third period. They were probably the best line for the San Jose Sharks in that third period, which is, a good thing considering they are supposed to be the Sharks' best line in general. And while they didn't actually end up scoring in that final 20-minute frame, of course, the 2 players here, Meier and Hertl, did combine for the overtime goal. So hopefully that'll be a bit, or I guess Hertl wasn't a part of it, but still, he was on the ice. And they end up getting that overtime goal, and hopefully that'll help open the floodgates a bit and maybe start accumulating some points for these 2 players. The second line, on the other hand, it was Couture with Cunnin and Nick Bonino. Somehow ends up getting a promotion from his pretty bad third line to now the second line. And generally, this was, I would say, the worst line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight. Primarily, this does have a lot to do with the fact that Luke Cunnin took 3 penalties here in this game, 2 of them in the offensive zone, which is like the ultimate insult for, NHL head coaches. If you take a single offensive zone penalty, they don't like that, but to take 2 in the same game is pretty much like the equivalent of if you insulted their mothers. So definitely not the nicest game from Luke Cunnin, and generally that kind of brought down the level of his line. Obviously, Nick Bonino, while I think there were a couple of decent shifts, he had a very nice penalty killing shift in particular. I believe that was early on in the second or maybe in the first period, but besides that, it even shrank this line not super effective. The third line here tonight, I guess, would be considered Gadjevich, Sturm, and Svechnikov. This had been the fourth line for the San Jose Sharks for the past few games, but I guess the Sharks decided to now consider it their third line, and I say they are certainly deserving of the promotion. There was no scoring coming from these 3 players here today, and it wasn't necessarily an amazing game from them either, but they still had some good looks. Nico Sturm had a pretty solid game, and generally it was already a very good fourth line for the San Jose Sharks. Now moving up the ladder a bit, it obviously does come down a bit because now you're expected to be at a slightly higher level, being the third line, and hopefully it can be competitive there. Speaking of the now new fourth line is Lorentz, joined by Lindblom and Nieto. This is because that Noah Gregor was, of course, a scratch once again here today, but on top of that, he was joined by Kevin Labanc. Now, Labanc, it's been a pretty quick fall from grace for him. Just in the first game of the season against the Nashville Predators, he put up a pretty impressive performance that really seemed to catch the attention of Sharks head coach David Quinn, so much so that in the second game of the season, Labanc got over 20 minutes of ice time, and yet now just 4 games later, he went from getting 20 minutes of ice time, one of the highest for all of the Sharks forwards in that particular game, to suddenly now just being a healthy scratch. It's, I don't even necessarily disagree with this point. Obviously, you could say, well, you want to play the younger players, but at this point, is Labanc necessarily considered a younger player here for the San Jose Sharks? He's, around the age of what Timo Meier is. I believe even a year older than him, if I'm not mistaken. So he's not necessarily considered some sort of still developing rookie type of talent like he may have been 3-4 years ago. At this point, he just doesn't seem to fit in to the Sharks lineup. I wouldn't hate to see him draw back in at this point. I mean, there are likely a couple of players that the Sharks are icing that are not better than Kevin Labanc, but to see him out, I don't hate it that much. But to speak of the rest of the fourth line, Lorentz honestly has been a pretty solid player for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season. When he's on the fourth line, he clearly looks like better than a fourth liner. And then he did have a few games on the second line where he looked like worse than a second liner, which is not to be a surprise. So I think he is much, much, much better suited for a bottom 6 role, obviously. And I think he actually fits in quite well there. When it comes to Lindblom, he had a decent game. Obviously, he hasn't played all of the Sharks games. He was a healthy scratch at a point this season for San Jose, draws back into the lineup here, and he's kind of in a similar position to Kevin Labanc, but with maybe a bit more leeway, you could say, at this point. Both of these players are more offensively oriented, but aren't necessarily good enough to be in the top 6 for the San Jose Sharks, and so you're sort of just having an offensive player there in the bottom 6, and at the moment, Lindblom got that spot for this game, and it worked out well enough that I suspect he'll keep that spot, and Labanc will likely be a healthy scratch a second time in a row. On the defensive side of things, we once again have the first, all 3 same defensive pairings, but even though it is these defensive pairings, it should be noted that, Mario Ferraro on the third pairing with Radim Simek still gets a hefty amount of minutes. So I believe 23, just over 23 minutes. So even though this is sort of on paper, Ferraro still plays a ton of ice time. Erik Karlsson, like I mentioned earlier, had the absolutely amazing effort there in the overtime. When it comes to the offensive side of the game, clearly there is no lack of effort for Erik Karlsson, at least in these past couple of games. Earlier on in the season, there certainly was, but at at the moment, Karlsson seems to be putting in that effort to try and get these points, try and get the Sharks that victory. He also had the shot that led to the Logan Couture goal that got the Sharks on the board originally, so a pretty solid game from Erik Karlsson. I thought also that that Mario Ferraro and Simek, when they were on the ice, also played pretty well. Ferraro actually had a couple of nice moves in the offensive zone, which was nice to see. Simek had a goal in this game off of a very nice play, and I tweeted out during this game that we had seen multiple times already this season Simek really trying to aggressively jump into the play and not necessarily being good enough to actually convert that into goals for the San Jose Sharks, but he finally manages to do that here in Game 6 of the regular season. You could say there was a bit of luck involved, as it was I believe a shot that broke his stick, which caused it to elude Igor Shesterkin in net, but still it was a very nice move from Simek, not something you were really expecting, and it was cool to see him score a goal here. And then finally, when it comes to the goaltender for the game, James Reimer was in between the pipes. When it comes to the 2 goals that he did let in, didn't have too much of a chance on the Panarin one, though he probably could have been a bit better on the Hedl one. However, having said that, he made a lot of very key saves for the San Jose Sharks on the penalty kill earlier on in this game. Back in the first period, he kept the Rangers off of the board at that point and generally played a very solid game, and the Sharks finally managed to reward him for that with giving him, pretty much the game off from the third period onward. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, and we shall see if this is the start of some sort of winning streak or if the Sharks will go back to how they looked in the first 5 games of the season with a loss. Class dismissed.